I'm Elizabeth Delazazra, and this year I'm the grad chair of the Graduate Humanities Forum. We're putting on this conference for you, and we would like to thank everyone for attending our annual symposium, Values of Color. We'd like to particularly thank our invited speakers, Richard Doyle, Torkwase Dyson, Nicole Fleetwood, and Mohan Matthen, and to our commentators, who you'll see later today, Tyler Williams and Gary Hatfield. We're very excited to observe and participate in the conversations they'll be having today. And we'd also like to thank Aaron Levy and Slot for hosting us in their beautiful gallery space, and Jim Inglis, Jennifer Conway, and Sarah Viney at the Penn Humanities Forum for everything they've done for us this year. We at the GHF would also particularly like to thank Chiming Yang, our faculty advisor and topic director at the PHF this year, for leading us in our workshop and in planning this symposium. We would also like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for funding the Graduate Humanities Forum and this annual symposium for the last 12 years. And I personally would like to thank all the other Graduate Humanities Forum fellows, without whose intellectual and physical labor the symposium would not have been possible. We at the Graduate Humanities Forum are very excited to explore values of color with you today. Over the course of this school year, we've explored many facets of color at our bi-weekly workshop. We've examined the role of color in book printing in both 18th century Japan and 17th century England. We've looked at race in 19th century American literature, at radical black aesthetics and contemporary art, and at the philosophy of color perception. We began our seminar with a reading from David Batchelor's Chromophobia. Batchelor points out the various ways that historically color has been treated as trivial, dangerous, or both simultaneously. In art, critics praised form and drawing over color, with color considered a feminine form that had to be subordinated to the masculine art of drawing. So much of the 20th century was caught up in a positivist, behavioralist scientific paradigm that saw color as peripheral and not as important as things that could be measured to a precise degree, like space or size. Color has a history of being treated as less important than other aspects of material reality. This symposium, along with the GHF workshop and the Penn Humanities Forum this year in general, returns to color with a more open mind. It takes color seriously as an important part of material, cultural, political, and aesthetic reality. The study of color demands an interdisciplinary approach because it touches so many facets of the world. Color is a physical object, pigments are processed or manufactured, but it is also experienced phenomenologically and has cultural and symbolic significance that varies over time and space. To give everyone a better sense of all of our research projects, we've each provided images that inform our research, and they'll be projected on this screen when nothing else is being shown throughout the day. These images show both how varied all of our research is and how much it speaks to each other. It is because we approach color from a variety of perspectives, disciplines, and time periods and geographic regions that we can try to understand and explore color in all of its complexity. This is also true of the wonderful panel of speakers we have with us today. The value of color is something that cannot be parsed from only one perspective or scholarly approach, because value is a rich concept with varied meanings. In color theory, the value of a color is the relative lightness or darkness of its hue, but a color's value is more than a mere physical property. Colors have value in terms of aesthetic merit. Certain colors are highly valued for being beautiful or for being pure. It can have value in terms of political importance. We live in red states, we live in blue states. We live in a world fundamentally shaped by a history of empire and slavery. Color can have value in terms of moral acceptability, a category often tied to value politics. Colors might be too garish or too feminine. It can have value in terms of material worth. Pigments are commodities and are therefore inextricably tied to the politics of commodity chains. The history of indigo, for example, is tied to slavery in the American South. But the question of color's values is also fundamentally a question of sensory perception and phenomenological experience, both within the individual and in the cultural collective. How can our perception of color affect the values we place on color? The value of color is also shaped by the descriptive language of color. How do we evoke color through value-laden words or actions? How do we assign qualities or quantities to different colors? How is color experienced through taste or touch as well as sight? We invited the speakers to reflect on the following questions. How and why do we classify and assign values, moral, economic, social, epistemic, to particular colors, even people of color, or material gradations from light to dark? How does color function in a modern economy? What is its role in making subjectivity legible through its performance? How does color function as a nonverbal communication that is effectively felt? To what degree is color a natural or physical property, and in what ways is it a rhetorical or cultural construction? How do institutions assign value to color? They each brought to the topic the perspective of their particular discipline and the perspective of their own work and research. We begin the day with a panel where they each present their own work, and in the afternoon we'll have two less formal roundtables, one on the relationship between color perception and value, and one exploring and summarizing the important themes discussed during the day. I now invite our moderators for our first panel, Jeannie and Ting Feng, to come up to introduce our speakers.
It is my pleasure to introduce first Richard Doyle, liberal arts research professor at Penn State University, where he holds appointments in English, Science, Technology, and Society, and the College of Information Science and Technology. Professor Doyle's research and teaching spans the fields of rhetoric, science fiction, and emerging technoscience. His interest in the rhetorics of technoscience, that is, the cultural and literary contexts and outlets of areas like sustainability, evolutionary biology, nanotechnology, and psychedelic and information sciences, is evident across his scholarship and writing. His publications include On Beyond Living, Wetwares, Experiments in Post-Vital Living, and his most recent book, Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere. One of his current projects is a complete digital edition online of Philip K. Dick's The Exegesis, which I think we might hear something about today. It is also my pleasure to introduce Torkwase Dyson, an interdisciplinary artist whose work revolves around investigating our connections to imagination, materiality, geography, and belonging. Based today in Brooklyn, Dyson received her MFA from Yale University in painting and printmaking, and her work, in multiple modes including painting, installation, performance, video, and sculpture, has been widely exhibited in solo and group exhibitions across the United States. She has worked on projects in such nearby locations as the Schuylkill River, and held residencies abroad in Guatemala, Panama, and Peru. She has also taught as visiting faculty at numerous institutions, including Philadelphia's own Tyler School of Art. Her work explores various kinds of ecologies, both natural and human, and the relationship between the body and the physical environment. In exploring these issues, Dyson presents challenging questions about nature and culture, about site, place, and environment, about translation and transformation.
It's my pleasure to introduce Nicole Fleetwood. Nicole Fleetwood is Associate Professor in the Department of American Studies and Director of the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She works broadly on visual culture and media studies, Black culture studies, ethnography, gender theory, and culture and technology studies. Among her many accomplishments are her book, Troubling Fiction, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which was the recipient of the 2012 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. And of course, her articles which appear in leading journals, including African American Review and American Quarterly. She is currently working on a study of prison art and visuality called Carceral Aesthetics, Prison Art and Public Culture, where she examines visual art and practices emerging inside prisons and about prison life. And finally, it's also my pleasure, of course, to introduce Mohan Matthen. Mohan Matthen has been Professor of Philosophy and Senior Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto since 2006. He is a leading scholar in philosophy of mind and philosophy of biology. Especially relevant to the theme of today are his influential works in philosophy of perception, which may have covered every interesting aspect of the field. These include his early works in functions and teleology, more recent works in memory, modalities of perception other than vision, multimodal integration, which he also studies under the Senses Project as the principal investigator. And finally, of course, color. Please join me in welcoming the speakers today. Thank you.
Great, good. Everybody transitioned out of that introductory space now. Really excited about what's going to unfold today. I mean, with a question like color and a question like value, two terms that can sort of exfoliate into multiple dimensions, I'm really looking forward to getting carried away on the adventure and seeing what everybody has to say. Lately, what I've been doing is going around and talking probably in the greatest mismatch between the number of words that I have to say and the number of words that I'm saying them about, which is Philip K. Dick's Exegesis. If you're not familiar with Philip K. Dick, he was broadly categorized as a science fiction writer, but grew up in the United States, grew up in Berkeley, California, born in 1928. Depending on how you parse it and slice it, he wrote something on the order of 40 novels and a couple hundred short stories. But his magnum opus, arguably, is in fact something he's simply entitled The Exegesis, which I've recently been told to stop saying is nearly 9,000 pages, because it's more than 8,000 pages, but we're not really sure how many pages it is. So it's not really just color that can't be quantified. It's the sheer outburst of graphomania that Philip K. Dick experienced between 1974 and 1982 that really, I doubt we'll ever really know how many people voted for George Bush in Florida. And I doubt we'll ever really know how many pages Philip K. Dick's exegesis quote really is, because the experience of counting them involves the experience of reading them, and the experience of reading them involves being transformed and put into a kind of qualitative differently state where you no longer really can count. So what does this have to do exactly with color? Well, the way I like to think about color, the way I learned to think about color a little bit in my last book is from an evolutionary perspective, where color can, among other things, function as an attention attractor. That gradients of color are ways in which sensory perception and consciousness are drawn to areas within an ecosystem. There were some beautiful images going on before of an orchid and an insect that uses that orchid as its camouflage. When I am sometimes asked how old I think poetry is, I don't know how many of you are asked that question, but I have some interesting undergraduates. I trace it to the evolution of angiosperms at the very least, maybe bacterial quorum sensing behavior 3.5 billion years ago, when bacteria learned how to glow in order to induce other bacteria to glow in order to allow them to share genetic information that were very short little genetic poems. But whether we're talking about angiosperms, flowering plants, which use the flower as a way of grabbing, enthralling the attention of another species in order to outsource its delectable duties of reproduction, right? Think about that, right? That's an extraordinary marketing achievement, right, that flowers were able to pull off, I think about 750 million years ago. Don't quote me on that one. We better use my phone and look it up. Or but the point is that color functions as, among other things, an attention gradient. It grabs our attention and turns it towards things. And in 1974, Philip K. Dick's attention was very much focused on his mouth, because he had just had oral surgery, and he was waiting in his Marin County, California apartment for the pharmacist to deliver a prescription of Darvon. If anybody remembers the 1970s, Darvon was a fairly common pain-killing but ineffective pain-killing drug, but he was waiting for this to arrive. And so you can kind of imagine the intensity of the waiting that is involved when you're in an extraordinary pain, which he was, waiting for these drugs to arrive. And so he was like kind of proverbially waiting on the man when finally the doorbell rang, and he went to the door, and there at the door was a delivery girl from the pharmacy, and the girl from the pharmacy wonderfully had, the drugs. So he could feel the proximity of his relief. He could feel the incipience of his healing. But of course, that's often the most difficult part, right? When you're about to feel some kind of redemption, salvation, release. And when he opened the door, he saw that around the neck of the delivery girl was a piece of jewelry, a fish-shaped piece of jewelry that the sun, which apparently the sun was shining in Marin County that day, which is not all that common, hit the jewelry and glinted off the jewelry, and his forehead was hit with what he described as, quote, a blinding flash of pink light. No big deal, right? The other day, I woke up in the morning and there's been an extraordinary cold, as you know, and I was looking out the window of my house and I allowed my eyes to get soft. So this is about the subjective experience of color and color as a nonverbal communication. And I allowed my eyes to get soft, and by allowing my eyes to get soft, I saw not only a glint off this like incredibly frozen, and it had been frozen and melted and frozen and melted bank of snow that I had shoveled off of my flat roof of my house. And the more I got into a feedback loop, as the more I was able to soften my own regard and not try to somehow control and see what the snowbank was, the glints proliferated and took on the entire spectrum of color, including the pink of the pink light that hit Philip K. Dick in the forehead. And what I noted, of course, in that relaxation into the color, that not only was my attention taken by it, but what was my attention turned towards? My attention was turned towards my capacity to enter into a feedback loop with my environment. It was not directed towards a sense of my distinction from my environment as a conscious, feeling, affective, living being, but as the radical continuity between myself and my environment, and the role that I was playing, even in that rather trivial example of experiencing the continuum between myself and the environment in terms of my own conscious ability to tune in and out of this veritable fairyland of color that was emerging from the bank. Just to answer any questions, the only beverages I had had that morning was a coffee and no other intoxicants besides the endogenous chemicals of this radically beautiful thing that each of us have between our shoulders was operating. So that helped me compress some of these 9,000 pages for you, because I realized that, here's a way of talking about why would one man write 9,000 pages in response to getting hit with this glint of pink light in the forehead. Well, part of it, from his point of view anyway, was that when he got hit with the pink light, it wasn't just pink light. He got what we would now call, and in fact he called it, he didn't call it a download of information, he was nailed with information. Now remember, he was waiting for the drugs, okay? A lot of times there's a kind of proclivity to go very quickly with the work of a counterculture writer like Philip K. Dick, and want to immediately objectify the experience by pointing to the causal relationship of their phenomenological experience and some drug experience, right? As if the drug experience weren't itself as deeply involved in that feedback loop that I experienced with the snowbank as anything else, but we'll put that to the side. So he experienced this download of information, or what he called being nailed by information. And so for the next 8 years, I think it's really fair to compress those pages that I have worked with, and I've worked with thousands, but I will never probably claim to be finished with this text. That I think it's fair to say that he was A, trying to understand pink. What is pink? And this kind of thoroughgoing, all-in quest for the ontology of pink. What is pinkness? Led him on this incredible, quest through all the global wisdom, knowledge traditions that can be imagined and accessed from 1974 to 1982, by a man of relatively limited means who has access to an Encyclopedia Britannica, Psychology Today, and perhaps most importantly, all of the bookstores of Marin County, Berkeley, California, and so on. He was deeply read in the esoteric traditions of Taoism, of Vedanta, of Buddhism, of contemporary literature, of philosophy, 20th century philosophy. The two most common names, much to my surprise thus far, that have come up in the exegesis in my reading, besides Spinoza and Plotinus, where if you want to understand pink, according to Philip K. Dick, encounter Spinoza and Plotinus, because I believe Dick was pointing to the need to experiment with a monist point of view where one understands oneself as involved in that feedback loop between self and environment and does not try to arrest the nature of color into an objective quality, nor to arrest it into a, quote, purely subjective experience, whatever those are. But the other two names were Heidegger and William Burroughs, which astonished me because I teach a course on OK Dick and William Burroughs, so how convenient. But the download of information was far more extensive than simply leading him on this global journey. According to his own account, he came to an understanding, and what he called a Gnostic understanding, a gnosis, that his son Christopher was suffering from a right inguinal hernia and needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. And of course, he did, being a parent, and they looked at him like he was a crazy man, which I think he was rather used to, actually. And they said, there's nothing wrong, but they looked, and of course, they had to operate immediately, and of course, the story goes, his life was probably saved by this operation on this right inguinal hernia, right? Total, undecidable bit of knowledge that has no business getting into Philip K. Dick's noggin through pink light, right? So this is in part why the 9,000-page journey. This is in part why the quest, because the quest is for not only what is the nature of pink, but what is the nature of self and knowledge, such that knowledge can be gathered not from the allegedly external environment to ourselves with which we can enter into a feedback loop, but through radical acts of deep introspection. That in fact, what the call Dick came to understand, a la a 1970s horror film, the call was coming from within the house. In other words, that the quest for what pinkness was really the classic and rather predictably, distressingly traditional quest for self-knowledge. So I wanted to read a little bit of the exegesis. I got my phone here somewhere. Is available, by the way, the full Monty of it, as it were, at zebrapedia.psu.edu. There's a whole story about, the capacity to get access to that and so forth that I won't go into. But all you have to do is go to that web address and create an account, which involves you agreeing that you're not going to discuss any of the contents of the exegesis with the media, which, what is the media now? I don't know. There was concern on the estate's part that if it's 9,000 pages, you don't know what's in there. You can't take an inventory of it and decide that it's okay to leak it. So they just want to make sure that nobody's going to go and talk about it. But the horse is out of the barn there. So I wanted to focus in on this question of what PKD, which is how he sometimes would go, Philip K. Dick, what kind of moments did he come to in terms of what was pink? And I thought apropos of this conference and its sort of deep questioning of both the sort of objective and subjective poles of color, that this passage in folder 54, it was arranged in folders, was particularly appropriate. And what I would suggest is, a la my experience on the bank, that pink for PKD was a recipe for what the Christian tradition, which Dick was very much influenced by, would call in Greek agape, the experience of selflessness, the experience of total unconditional love, which can be experienced only through the dissolution of that subject-object boundary. And so when he was trying to figure out what pink was, he said, and I used to have to, put my fingers in my ears when Dick would start talking this way because I couldn't figure out how to be comfortable with it. But part of the journey has become comfortable with his idiom. He said, it's Christ. In 274, February 74, so 41 years ago, there was no pink light as such. You can hear his philosophical reading there, right? But sunlight, fish sign plus light, like Bohm, Jacob Bohm, the cobbler, the 17th century cobbler, who Hegel kind of both borrows heavily from and decides is a kind of primitive philosopher because his is the direct experience of self-knowledge and not the systematic unfolding and deduction of knowledge. Bohm, like PKD, experienced this moment of total, to him, self-gnosis. And it was intriguingly under the influence of looking at a pewter dish on a sunny day when the light hit the dish and hit him in the eye, and he had an experience of what he called capital S seeing, right? So it's somehow this capacity of the optical to allow us to enter into this state whereby the subject-object distinction falls away, or at least the perception of the subject-object distinction falls away for a moment, that for Dick that was crucial, and he writes, if my phone will cooperate, it's making me log in for Agape, like Bohm and Mr. Tagami, who is his character in Man in the High Castle, who, intriguingly, in his 1962 book, is looking at a piece of jewelry, saying to it, cough up that arcane secret. He's trying to figure out what it has. It has something which I think we would call the aesthetic. And it's transported into an alternate dimension, essentially. So that's folder 5709. The last thing I'll say is that then the remainder of folder 57 is concerned with trying to work out the nature of how to compress and transmit this experience of what he calls agape. And so pink light for Dick in sending him on this quest towards self-dissolution is a kind of recipe for agape. So thank you for your attention.
So hi, I'm Torkwase. Thanks for having me. And before Rich, I'm sorry. Before Rich's talk, I thought I knew what my work was about. I'm seriously having a moment here. So I'm going to look at my notes from his presentation and then I guess reintroduce you to my work and reintroduce myself to my work. So the framework is such that the piece is called The Color of Crude, and I've been diving in the Gulf of Mexico for about 3 years, thinking about the oil and gas extraction industry and the technology, engineering, and apparatuses that facilitate that extraction, and sort of paralleling that to those areas in the Gulf where Africans are traded in ports, and thinking about natural resources, or this ocean, this body of water in particular, as a natural resources that hosts sort of hyper-capitalist trades in body and crude. So what I've done is, as an artist, you go and you get your diving certificates, and then you go to these sites that are historically and culturally and economically significant to make this project. And as I do this, I document my process. And what you're looking at is an artificial reef, and I'm sure most of you know, or some of you may know, that a lot of the oil rigs that were installed in 1920s and 1950s, as they sort of disappeared all of the marine life, what has happened now is the coral reef has begun to establish a new life on the beds of these oil rigs, or repopulating that space with a vast number of different kinds of marine life. So that sort of irony I was interested in too. And also the sort of sediments in the Atlantic Ocean and the ridge in terms of sediments and black bodies who didn't make it during the slave trade, but were either thrown off or tossed or jumped over. So that sort of, matter transference in that space I connected to conceptually. And so what I do is I go and I take images of the large tankers as documentation, and I sort of, in this cartographic practice, map out 3 tankers, and I dive. And what now I understand is, I think I'll use some of your language. Oh, well, I think I am the subject now. And what happens in the dive in terms of my relationship with color, and I wrote this also, I guess color allows me to begin to comprehend something that's unmeasurable, right? The transatlantic slave trade, that space between Galveston, Texas and New Orleans, where my people are from, that kind of maritime practices with black bodies is sort of indeterminable. A lot of slave history was documented in interior lands, but not so much in terms of maritime practices. So I was interested in that, and so I created this video that I'm going to show you as an art project that responds to me trying to overlap those histories. And so I'll show the video and then talk about color as I now understand it and my perceptions of it and my body, allowing the subjective to take over as our experiences making this work. So what happens in terms of my own sort of entering into understanding the world through color is that, or understanding my history, my body, who I am, through colors. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, southeast side. That means we were near the lake, so blue and sort of vibrant sunlight was a part of my knowing who I am. And when I was old enough to kind of conceive of and begin to understand how bodies were transported over large bodies of water and then sort of hoisted in these dungeons of darkness and different sites, all of that in my mind, I was unable to sort of comprehend, and I don't think we can, that sensory experience of that. So sensoria became a sort of question. And what I thought I was doing was sort of collaging what it meant to deal with sunlight, water, refraction, water, sunlight moving underwater at a different, of course, speed than not underwater, the sort of really color and form of the rigs themselves, to sort of abstract this question around not simultaneity, but just similarities around what we do with body in our natural environment. So now I think that I'm doing that and I'm thinking about that, but I'm also, as I am down there, I am really having a subjective experience with all of these moments, with weight, buoyancy. I'm down there and I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm there trying to figure out the history of my black body in the sort of arc of genealogy, right? But also the sort of what is happening to black bodies in their sort of vulnerabilities around environmental change, climate change, and what that means globally. But I mean, in addition, I'm sorry, I'm really having a transformation, I think. So what is violet, right? What is black? What is blue? What is now refraction, right, as I experience it? So one of the things that we did as a diver, we have to get your deep sea sort of certificate, we have to do what's called a penetration dive. And the penetration dive says that you can go 60 to 110 feet below. And even though I'd done some scuba diving, done some sort of regular diving, I'd never done it in basically a large cylinder. So the dive instructor said, okay, well, you're now ready to do this other training. So I was used to seeing a certain relationship of sunlight and blue and water at about 50 to 60 feet, but I'd never done it where all of that was blocked out, all the color then just kind of disappeared. And so during this training, the further you go in your penetration dive, the less you can see, and all you can do is touch the walls of the cylinder. And so I'm, trying to breathe, trying to watch all my apparatuses, trying to make sure my science is right and my physics is right. And then I look up, and all I see is this very clean circle, right? Just this very sort of clean circle, almost like a Nancy Holt, sculpture. It was like, oh my goodness. And then I thought about, in this, because I'm making these dives and training to do this work about my ancestors, and I can't then imagine, the sensory on board, right? The sensory on board, with bodies on board, like looking through this sort of light that they must have seen. And so now I think, I don't know what I think now, but because I guess I'm recognizing my own sort of, questions around color and space and density and depth. And I thought I was grappling with something outside of myself. But I'm not, I guess. Sorry. Ugh. So anyway, that's it. We can talk later when I get home.
So, good morning. And I just want to say I'm so moved by the first two presentations. I love being a student, and I'm just this morning already kind of overwhelmed by this multi-sensory experience of being here. And I should say that, thank you for the beautiful introduction. I can't remember the name of the person's introduction, but thank you. So I am working on a project on prison art and visuality, and it's very much about color and value. But I'm sharing with you today from a project that, a little tiny book that I have coming out in a couple of months. It's called On Racial Icons. And it's really it's a meditation. I try to, I hope to join my readers in decelerating and looking at things that are very familiar to us around color, race as color and value, and how we create value around iconic forms, specifically looking at photography. So these are images today. The images I'm going to show you are images that you've seen. You've seen all of them. So from early on, I, like many, was aware that my experience of being a young black girl was an experience of living in relationship to images of blackness and black subjects that circulated broadly in the public sphere. As a child, I knew that I had no control over these images and how they were disseminated, but that many of my interactions in public spaces with blacks and non-blacks would be in conversation with these images. I also knew that those images, more often than not, presented a challenge to my very existence, to being able to occupy space without expectation, deficit, or reaction. How did I know these things on such a deep guttural level as early as the 3rd grade? In particular, given that I grew up in a majority black neighborhood and went to a black elementary school. So what is this power that we, as a broad American public, affix to certain images of race as color and nation, specifically the black icon? Within this broad category of public images, I am interested in those that are normative to our understanding of race and value. These are images that have a common sense, value, and meaning in terms of the national imaginary and a broad public familiarity with these images. They are interwoven into how a dominant, media-saturated American public understands race as interstitial to the formation of nation. And by American public, I do not mean to suggest that there's one definition of Americans or what constitutes the public, but I'm interested in this as a fraught concept, as a necessary fiction of how various constituents, populations, and individuals make sense of the nation as a collective body. In particular, our in quotation, attachments to certain public images have come to represent and or substitute for a larger historical narrative of race as blackness in this country. These images often carry a sort of public burden in their attempts to transform the despised into idolized. In this formal and symbolic characteristic of ideation, they work against the long and visual-rich history of degrading racial caricatures. Racial icons, especially in the realm of social and political movements, make us want to do something that impact us with such emotional force that we are compelled to do, to feel, to see. While the affective responses, what one might call the impulse to act, or the urgency expressed in some images, our individual and collective actions are not predictable or easy to measure in any specific, linear, or casual way. And this morning I want to focus on our collective mourning that takes place around the posthumous icon as a mode of black artfulness and survival. Here I focus on the production of the posthumous icon through I Am Trayvon Martin campaigns. And first I want to begin by honoring Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, their families, all who nurtured and influenced Trayvon and who have given us permission to claim him as we have in various public awareness campaigns since his death. So in writing as mourning in this event as a performative act and of breathing life into the dead, of inhaling and exhaling the arrested breaths of Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and the many, many others, I enact a mode of racial belonging that is conflicted in its use of substitution and that is also cathartic in its attempt to make visible and to perform a long and continual process of grieving racial violence and morbidity. Black iconicity hinges on a relationship between veneration and denigration, and is this twinning that shapes the visual production and reception of Black American icons. Life, one of the many reasons why Black subjects turn to the sacred, venerate the dead, appeal to forces beyond the material, speak to and for the unseen, credit a deity for everyday and out-of-this-world miracles is in racially inflected ways that speak to local and diasporic communities is for one basic reason, to declare in spite of evidence all around us to the contrary, that Black lives matter. As distinct from energy, to matter, to have a mother, to make an archive for one's life and death to have material consequences. What we know, on February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black American teenager, was killed while walking back to his father's fiance's home from a nearby convenience store in Sanford, Florida. George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch guard, noticed Martin walking, followed him, confronted him, and ultimately shot and killed him. After noticing Martin from his vehicle, Zimmerman called the Sanford police and reported that Martin was acting suspiciously and that he looked like he was up to no good, or, quote, that he was on drugs or something. Zimmerman identified Martin's hoodie, a sweatshirt with a hood, as one of the features that marked Martin as suspicious. According to public records, the dispatcher told Zimmerman to remain in his vehicle and that an officer will be sent out to investigate. We all know this. However, Zimmerman, as the saying goes, and as the history of American vigilantism and racism reveal, took the law into his own hands and pursued Martin nonetheless. By the time the dispatch car arrived, Martin was lying in a pool of his own blood, fatally wounded. It was not until the next day that Martin's father, Tracy, would learn of his son's fate. When the teenager was not home by the next morning, Tracy contacted the police to file a missing person report. Shortly thereafter, officers arrived at Tracy's home. They showed a photograph of a dead Trayvon Martin and asked if this was his missing son. With little inquiry or investigation, the killing was quickly filed as self-defense by the Sanford Police Department under Florida's notorious justifiable use of force statute, most commonly known as the Stand Your Ground law. Despite the fact that Sanford police questioned the credibility of Zimmerman's account of the events, Zimmerman was released under this law. Even though the case was initially dismissed, these bare facts no one disputes: that Trayvon Martin was a Black boy walking home, that Zimmerman deemed him suspicious, and that Zimmerman killed him. The story of that tragic winter's night in Central Florida does not end there, although Martin's life did. While the local authorities readily dismissed the case, Martin's death reached international attention in large part due to the commitment of his parents to seek justice for their son's murder. Their effort was aided by the viral transmission of information through the internet and the strategic use of Martin's image as part of this campaign. In fact, many people learned about Martin's death through online petitions that were posted on Facebook and other networks, demanding that Sanford District Attorney's Office bring charges against Zimmerman. The outcry and protest of millions, including several high-profile celebrities and public figures, led to an inquiry by the Department of Justice and eventual charges against Zimmerman. A prominent strategy to gain awareness of Martin's death was the circulation of the photograph of him as an ordinary teenager. And I place ordinary in quotation marks because there's little doubt that a Black teenage boy is never seen as an ordinary American, let alone an ordinary child who deserves protection and guidance of adults and public authorities. Nonetheless, the photographs used in awareness campaigns by supporters of justice for Trayvon are striking and compelling, given the context of his death and the state's effort to absolve his murderer. One photograph, the most well-known, is a black and white self-portrait known as a selfie in the social media landscape. The selfie is a form of representation that intimately projects how one wants to be perceived by an audience, especially among one's peers in the digital media realm. The selfie is a contemporary form of vernacular photography, the most widely practiced genre of photography since its inception. In its everydayness and the ease of access that consumers have to photographic software and technology in this contemporary era, the selfie makes self-portraiture a more common practice than any other period in history. Although it often appears fleeting and can be erased in an instant by digital technology, the selfie is nonetheless part of the storied genre of portraiture. Like other portraits, the selfie is a deliberate representation of a public persona, a mode of self-conscious sitting in front of the photographic lens. Whether playful, sensuous, earnest, aspirational, the selfie suggests a desire for recognition. It is a request for acknowledgement, an appeal to be a subject of value. In this now famous self-portrait, Martin looks down into the lens with one shoulder raised as if he is leaning. He wears a hoodie. The lighting from above and the cap shaping his face create a halo effect. In the sheath provided by the hoodie, Martin's face appears to float. He hovers and levitates as his eyes peer out from under his hood. The affect is that of a foreshadowing, as speaking to audiences from the silence of death. Even as it feels as if it were a sort of premonition, Martin's selfie is also a performance of presence. He is, at that moment, alive, self-documenting, and archiving his presence for meaning and circulation. His downward tilted eyes avoid contact, and yet they reveal an inquisitive gaze. This ordinary boy has captured an image of himself that after his murder circulates as a posthumous icon. The boy, who died in large part due to a look that rendered him suspect in public, becomes venerated through a self-image that captures that very look. With this singular photograph, we see how image and context work together to produce an icon. As lethal and vile as racial intolerance and violence are, the forces of love, recognition, and the pursuit of justice are crucial to the emergence of Martin as an icon. We as a public know of Martin's harrowing fate because of the courage and dedication of his parents, who began that online campaign through a petition demanding for the arrest of Zimmerman. The use of Martin's selfie in campaigns for justice led to a form of protest in which millions of people in countries of, across the world donned hoodies, posed before a camera, and proclaimed, "I am Trayvon Martin." The protest took place on multiple platforms at rallies, small and large, across the country. Groups showed up in hoodies with signs declaring, "I am Trayvon Martin," "We are Trayvon Martin." Selfies were posted on personal pages of social media sites with members hooded, somber, and staring into the camera. Others used a black and white silhouetted graphic of a male profile and hoodie. The Miami Heat basketball team took a group photograph of the team hooded with heads bowed. Protesters who claimed, "I am, we are Trayvon Martin," were politically, racially, ethnically, linguistically, and geographically diverse. They were representative of how complexly heterogeneous the 21st century American public is. The protests, in this case, express an infinite dynamism and multiple embodiment of racial iconic form, even in its tragic outcomes. The reactions of many to Martin's death register subtle and enormous changes in the United States that can only be briefly sketched here. It marks the profusion and rapid circulation of representation in contemporary era. The number of photographs produced have mushroomed in large part because of the access to low-cost digital cameras. In addition, the Justice for Martin protests speak to changing perception and reception of the icon and what it means to have staying power in a cultural climate where the consumption of images occur more often involuntarily and with such rapidity and plenitude that it makes it challenging to hone in on any singular image. Furthermore, these photo-based protests signal generational and racial shifts among many black and non-black protesters. Masses of protesters imagine and temporarily identify with blackness in ways that are not through minstrelsy, slumming, or parody. Instead, one could argue that these images symbolically demonstrate an identification with racial isolation, profiling, and forms of abject suffering associated with certain groups of blacks and other vulnerable populations in this country and elsewhere. In this light, many non-blacks are able to recognize a young black male as a sympathetic character, as one with whom they form a deeply emotional and performative attachment, a type of claiming, and to see the machinations of structural and quotidian racism to portray him as other. The emotional waves of identifying with Martin reached the White House, whether rooted in perceived or actual public pressure, or a personal sense of the shared experience of racial profiling. President Obama, felt compelled to link his life outcomes to those of Trayvon Martin. Many have argued that as president, Obama has been too cautious in speaking about race because of expectations of many that he should address the significance of racism in the nation's past and present. After growing tensions about Martin's murder and pressure from the public to see justice in Florida, Obama went on record stating, quote, "You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon." The president's words affirmed what many sympathetic to Martin's parents felt. For some on the front line of protesting, there was cautious hope that Obama would be more vocal and active in his stance against racism. Contrarily, he was widely criticized by politically conservative commentators and accused of race baiting. Yet even still, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, Obama seemed to identify even more closely with Martin. He spoke of his own experiences of being racially profiled and then stepped into the dead boy's shoes by claiming, "Trayvon Martin could have been me." His statement both led some to question what connects Obama to a 17-year-old boy who died so violently, so painfully outside a gated community in Florida, and helped to also ensure that boy's iconic status. Obama's assertion seems even more intentionally jarring, given how very different the backgrounds and outcomes of their lives are. What Obama was signaling was an affective kinship that linked him to Martin in a racial fraternity of being marked as public threats and being subject to extreme forms of violence because of that marking. It is no exaggeration to write that in the weeks and months after Martin's killing, millions of people clung to the selfie of Martin in his hoodie, the attachment to his image and its significance to various constituents of Americans. Just get the line. The attachment to Martin's image and its significance to how various constituents of the American populace understand racialized embodiment, violence, and lack of access to the public sphere grew more palpable during the struggle to have Zimmerman prosecuted for Martin's death. In the days and weeks after his killing, and without any prosecutorial action, protests and identification with him grew more urgent and violent. And then in a longer paper, I go on to talk about the actual trial, but I'm going to kind of skip over some of that just for time's sake here. On July 13, 2013, after 16 and a half hours of deliberating, we all know this, the jury acquitted George Zimmerman of second-degree murder and manslaughter. Given systemic racism and injustice in this country, some scholars and critics argue that Zimmerman's acquittal was not an anomaly, but an example of the workings of U.S. nation as a racist state. Robin D.G. Kelly, a respected scholar of the Black freedom struggles, writes, quote, "The point is that justice was always going to elude Trayvon Martin, not because the system failed, but because it worked. Martin died and Zimmerman walked because of our entire political and legal foundation were built on an ideology of settler colonialism, an ideology in which the protection of white property rights was always sacrosanct. Predators and threats to those privileges were almost always black, brown, and red, and where the very purpose of police power was to discipline, monitor, and contain populations rendered as threat to white property and privilege," end quote. So immediately after Zimmerman's acquittal, there was nonstop coverage and protests against the verdict. I, like many, especially Black mothers, felt and still feel heartbroken, demoralized, shocked, and enraged. For so many of us, the series of events around Martin's murder and Zimmerman's release, with the image of Martin at the center. With the image of Martin at the center of the protests and the trial is the reopening of a deeply painful wound, or deeply painful many wounds. Since his death, photographs of Martin could circulate as palliation and wound. In some pictures, Martin smiles. Here he floats about on paper and electronically as a thoughtful and loving child and friend. We, the sympathizers and silent majority, are encouraged to see him as earnest, curious, sweet, and innocent. An impossible stands for a Black boy in a racial state where Blackness is by default suspicious. In a notable photograph used by protesters to untangle the visual and symbolic codes that align Blackness with deadly threat, Martin poses with his father, who hugs and kisses his son. Here, a child receives recognition, protection, and guidance. This is a child who's deeply loved and cared for. Yes, a boy was murdered. We love him in all his photographic beauty. as another victim of racial violence. This boy, Trayvon Benjamin Martin, was the son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. He was the brother of Javaris Fulton and a cousin and friend to many. He was born on February 5th, 1995, and died one terrifying evening shortly after his 17th birthday as he walked from a convenience store. There is no longer a Trayvon Martin, a living one to flesh out what a photograph cannot contain, his corporeal presence, an experimentation with life's possibilities, a future based in childhood dreams and offspring. There will never be another indexical photograph of an embodied and maturing Trayvon Martin to complicate the widely circulating images of him, especially the photograph of a dead black boy that circulates in his post-mortem state. Trayvon Martin is a historical figure. He is a dead black boy. He is an index. He is a specific case. He is symbol and icon. He is all of this and more. Martin's image has been reproduced many millions of times since he died on the sidewalk outside a gated community where he was visiting. He's a goofy boy with a young female confidant, Rachel Gentile. He is an aspiring pilot. He enjoys watching the NBA. He poses with grills in his mouth. There he is posterized as a Facebook profile, as a flyer passed around to announce a demonstration, as a billboard. On t-shirts and hoodies, he is silhouetted. He is our baby boy whom we want to hug. He's our warning sign of what happens to black boys. He is a threat in the mind of white paranoia. Martin's image moves through various locations and media platforms. He circulates as material object, viral transmission, traumatic wound, and historical fact. He lives through his image because of our attachment to it, our attachment to the historical legacy of blacks, to black masculinity, and to the historical present of racial subjugation. I have never worn a hoodie in honor of Martin. At the same time, I am part of the we-making machine, but I need to imagine that there are others, many others, who share with me the abiding wish that Sabrina and Tracy had their son alive and in their arms. We intimately enfold the image of Martin, smiling from under his hoodie, into our narratives of family, belonging, and love. We publicly memorialize Martin's photograph and murder as part of the long and painful unfolding narratives of race, violence in the American public sphere. We are not Trayvon Martin. We are alive, but through our lives we breathe life into him, and we create matter that sustains his life. Why are we not marching as the millions of others who are terrorized, imprisoned, and killed by the structures of racial violence that devalue black life, such as the many young blacks who have died at the hands of other blacks in Chicago? The indexes of those impacted are so numerous and so quotidian that we gravitate even more strongly to the singularity of the icon, the beautiful face of a black teenage boy peering out from under his hoodie, seeking recognition. When we can isolate the image and hone in on a specific instance, then the emotional floodgates and the historical baggage pour out on the weight of that one boy. And for all its messiness, we rewrite history so that Trayvon Martin did not die alone on a sidewalk outside of a gated community. We carry his body, we wear his mask, we don the hoodie as a declaration that his life mattered, that black lives matter, and in so doing, we attempt the impossible task of breathing life into his body and returning him to the loving arms of his father and his mother. Thank you.
I just want to talk today about, that sound okay? I just want to talk today about two quite unique characteristics of color as a sensed feature of things. I'll try and say one or two things that link to the earlier presentations, because I was struck as I was listening to them how connections could be made. My own presentation is somewhat abstract, as you'll see, but I'll try and connect them. So first I want to talk about, the first property I want to talk about is the almost unique aesthetic interest in color. So here's a painting by Josef Albers called Homage to the Square. The title's a bit wry because the square's not doing a whole lot of work there. So, here's Homage to the Square. Right. Unless he meant that the color was paying homage to the square by decorating it or something, but making it more interesting. But that's not terribly interesting, you would think. But of course, a lot of artists have played with color and form, with color doing almost all the work. So here's Mark Rothko. A lot of people report, apropos Richard's remark about attention, that Rothko in fact does the opposite to you. It sort of puts you into a zone of no attention, a sort of a reverie. So color has both sorts of functions, both of drawing attention and also of zoning you out into a non-attentive state. There's Barnett Newman. Here's Gerhard Richter, who played with a lot of different colors. He has a formula to randomize the appearance of colors in these. I believe that's 4,096 colors, if I'm not mistaken, and that's 15 times 12, whatever that is, 225. That's not right. Anyway, and here he reproduced his work in this magnificent south transept window in Cologne. Here's Damien Hirst. Blake Gottnick says something very strange. Hirst's spots give an atom's eye view of how the world really is. Atoms aren't colored, so that's a sort of a strange thing for him to have said. So it not certainly doesn't give us an atom's view of color, because as Democritus famously said, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention colored, but in reality atoms and the void. So stripes and squares and dots had no, or I shouldn't say no, but relatively little interest in themselves. But colors just all by themselves seem to have a great deal. And one question you might ask is, why should that be? And then why should you be fascinated by color, though, as all three previous speakers, no, actually, Nicole, I'll come back to you in a second, but obviously there's a great deal of fascination, and one question that you might ask is why? By the way, I'm not going to answer that question, though I'll point you in some direction that's relevant, or at least seems to me to be relevant. Okay, so here's Albers. Albers writes in this strange style where he breaks things up into lines as if they were poetry, and quite often it's not poetry at all, but here we go. In musical composition, he says, so long as we hear merely single notes, we do not hear music. We're able to hear a single tone, but we almost never, that is without special devices, see a single color. He thinks that you never, when you're looking at that Mark Rothko black, you're not seeing a single color, according to him. Unconnected and unrelated to other colors. As a consequence, this proves for the reading of color what Kandinsky often demanded for the reading of art. What counts is not the what, but the how. Sort of puzzling remark, but the idea is that you can present a tone all by itself. You can't present a color all by itself. So you might think that you're looking at a simple color, but according to Albers, you never are, except in very strange circumstances. So we get pleasure from looking at monochrome expanses and simple combinations of colors. And that pleasure is just the pleasure of looking, or it could be the displeasure. But the point is that it's not something that goes beyond the mere looking of it. But we do not get corresponding pleasure from sensing simple tones or tastes, or even, I would argue, touches. Any pleasure we get from tones or tastes or touches is linked to consuming something, or being in a positive or negative emotional state, not the pleasure of simply expressing it. So there's a lot of argument in philosophy about whether touch, for instance, could be aesthetic. And the argument is no, because even though you might think you're enjoying the mere experience of touch, you're in fact, there's something more that's involved in it, which goes beyond the experience. Okay, so that's one characteristic of color, namely that it's aesthetically very rich. By contrast, it's informationally extremely poor, as I'll try to argue now. So there is a use for color as far as information is concerned, and that use is to identify objects. So here are people who identify their suitcases by strapping little colored bands on them, very effective. But what does color tell you about an object other than which object it is? Right? It tells you, I will argue in a minute, nothing about which kind, or it tells you a bit about what kind of object it is. Not really, because what color does is to enable us to identify membership in a class, but it doesn't tell you very much about that class. So color can tell you about the condition of something. It can tell you bruises, abrasions. It can tell you that somebody is in an emotional state. That's because these bruises and abrasions and emotions have a color which enables you to classify them. But the fact that a bruise hurts or that an abrasion was the result of a cut, or that somebody's darkening is a sign of emotion, that is not something that the color tells you. It's something that is associated with the class which the color helps to identify. So again, ripe versus unripe fruit, you have to learn fruit by fruit what color indicates ripeness. It's not as if red is always ripe and green is always unripe. There are fruit for which this is not the case. So again, all that happens is that you identify a class, and then you associate with these classes ad hoc properties such as the above. This is very true, obviously, of racial color, right? I mean, all it does is to put you in a class. It doesn't tell you anything about the actual intrinsic properties of that class. So you know the red or orange, if in India it's orange, in Mexico it's red, mango is ripe, but this doesn't generalize to pears and certainly doesn't generalize to London buses. London buses are red but not ripe. And you don't even know that two red objects have the same frequency profile. Even that is not the case. A phenomenon known as metamerism, which just doesn't exist with respect to sounds. With sounds, at least you know what the frequency profile is. In the case of color, you don't. So, texture and shape tell you about the physical properties of things. So, for example, you know that this sphere, also by Gerhard Richter, by the way, you know certain things about it just by looking at it. What do you know? You know that it can be rolled, and everything else of this shape can be rolled. Contrast the case of color, where you could not make that kind of generalization. You know that it's smooth and cool to touch, like everything else that is shiny and metallic. That's an association. It cannot be stacked on any other sphere. You can't just make a stack of spheres. Vision tells you all of the above, even though the things that we're talking about, like rolling and so on and so forth, are not visual properties. So spatial properties revealed by vision have physical reality. The sphere, that has physical reality, which is able to tell you certain things about it, namely that it can be rolled and so on and so forth. But color properties don't reveal physical reality, and thus they don't generalize, which they're hooks for generalization, because you can put things in a class and then associate properties with it. They're hooks in that way, sometimes very misleading hooks, but they don't generalize in virtue of their own nature. Okay, so why is all of this the case? So color information is extracted from three overlapping broadband cells in the eye. This one is just for brightness, the so-called rod, and doesn't work during the day, only works in low illumination situations. So the three colors which are important, the three cells which are important for color are the long wave, the medium wave, and the short wave cones. And as you see, these cones overlap a lot, including, for instance, the long and the median. As you see, the long, they're not even very well shaped. The long one has this rising tail, which I'll talk about more in a second. So the L cone, take one example, can't distinguish between a weak cell of roughly 560 nanometers and a rather strong light from, these are sensitivity cones, so a strong one will produce as much of a response here as a weak one here. So it tells you very little about the intrinsic color of the light that's hitting it. And you might ask, well, given that this information is so little, right, why not have more? Why don't we have 5 cone cells? Why don't we have 10 cone cells? You know, with audition, you essentially have one receptor per frequency band, you know, because the ear is shaped that way. But in vision, you don't. Why is that? And the reason is that vision isn't primarily a chromatic modality. What vision's job is to give you a map of objects in space. So if you had more cones cells dedicated to getting chromatic information, you would have to pack them into the same location in the eye, and as a consequence, you'd make the eye much less acute with respect to spatial differences. And the job of vision is primarily spatial, not chromatic. So, in fact, among mammals, very few species have color vision at all. Okay, notice this rising tail of the L cone. That accounts for why violet, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum than red, nonetheless has a reddish tinge to it, right? Because it's excited by those low frequencies. How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay, so you can map the colors depending on how they affect the cone cells. These are 2 cone cells. And this is how the colors of the spectrum, which are at the end of the boundary of that shape, you can see that. This measures how the color affects the cones. Note that the shape of this completely distorts the physical reality that underlies. So for instance, the mid-spectrum occupies a lot of space there. The ends of the spectrum occupy a lot less space. And the ends of the spectrum are closer to one another than each of them is to the middle. So the whole thing has become quite distorted as far as physical reality is concerned. There's a process called opponent processing, which tries to at least get more information out in a legible form. So for example, this very squished end of the blue corner, opponent processing, what it does is to try and subtract x from y. And when it subtracts x from y, it decompresses that corner just a bit. It decompresses it because, as you notice, while this one, the short one, is increasing, this one is decreasing, it's going further back. And as a result, you can x minus y, it decompresses a little bit with respect to x plus, or x and y. So what you get there, you get something like that. Opponent processing, this sort of maximizes the legibility of color, but that's all it does. It doesn't increase informational content at all. The structural layout is totally out of correspondence with the real properties of color. By the way, it's an interesting thing, and maybe I'll say something about this afternoon. Skin color all occurs in just this little area here, right, and towards the black end. The black-white is this way. So skin color occurs in little 1/8. So as a friend of mine wrote to me recently, I was at a summer school in Greece, and there were a number of shades of brown represented there, and we were all sort of childishly comparing, you darker, am I darker? And there was this Lebanese woman who said that she had always thought of herself as a white Lebanese, which was pretty clearly nothing like that. One thing that we came to realize was really we're all just different shades of orange. Question is whether we're darker or lighter. Anyway, so these things are not real. And recall Alba's quoting Kandinsky, it's a how, not a what. Okay, so here's the idea that uniquely among sensory properties, color and intercolor structural relations correspond to nothing real. Alba's interactions of colors are simple artifacts of the brain's processing of color. So, color is unique in two ways. First of all, it's informationally uniquely poor. And secondly, it's aesthetically uniquely rich. And you might ask whether there's any connection between those two facts. So, very quickly, because I really don't want to say very much about this, but I'm going to just throw out a suggestion. So Kant rightly held that aesthetic pleasure is pleasure in contemplating something, in this case, looking at color. It's not quite aside from any pleasure derived from consuming it. Need-based consumption, such as gustatory or sexual pleasure, typically not considered aesthetic because they're both too closely tied to the pleasure of consumption. Both recede when consumption has reached its natural end. So when the value of consumption is highly salient, the value of contemplation recedes. So, suggestion. When we contemplate shapes and tones, we naturally consume the information that resides in them. Aesthetic pleasure in these things comes only from their arrangement and interactions. And color carries little information. Free-floating color, in fact, carries no information. Contemplating it is informationally disinterested. So when we dwell on the beauty of color, because we are not distracted by the information that it contains. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Colors are shot through with political, cultural, environmental, and personal significance. In politics or in artistic creation, we can exploit the fact that color grabs our attention, the phenomenal relations between colors, and the associations colors cause us. Laura, Ting Feng, Alan and I met about the comments Alan and I are about to offer. And something that came up over and over again was an interest in better understanding how color represents or carries information about the world, and about how color means or signifies to perceivers. Alan's going to touch on this topic in a very different way, but we view our comments as sort of circling at least roughly the same set of concerns. At a very general level, we agreed that the projects presented this morning raised challenging questions about how we should think about the representational nature of color, but also about how we should conceive of the responsibilities we bear in relation to color in virtue of how it represents. First, I'm interested in the suggestion that the similarity structure of color doesn't itself carry information, carry informative value, for example, about the luminance, reflectance, or composition qualities of objects. Ting Feng and I are graduate students in philosophy studying the representational nature of color and how perceptual representation relates to conceptualization even. And this idea of informational paucity raises questions for both of us about how to think about analogous cases, like the case of spatial or tonal perception. So you talked about these more in depth in your talk. But in particular, I guess we're interested to hear more about the sense in which we can think about color as unique in its informational paucity. So surely the contemplation of space created on a canvas using lines or shapes is aesthetically interesting, for instance? Would you say that that's a case of illusory perception? Or how exactly is color unique in this way? One of the fellows pointed out that this question might be even more pressing for a culture that is sometimes considered to be especially visual and invested in symbol making. I'd also like to press for a discussion about the relation, or maybe even tension, between the idea, on the one hand, that color involves this kind of informational paucity, and on the other, the idea that color can be responsible for the rich and highly complex emotional, political, cultural reactions in a group of people, given, say, some particular historical and cultural context. I wonder, for example, if we can ever genuinely experience a color, especially color presented in some sense imagistically, in a gallery or on the internet as an object, independent of the aesthetic structures in which we embed colors, whether such structures are determined by learning, association, and or the determinant relations among phenomenal hues. By choosing to mount or depict some particular instance of red or pink in space, for example, what is the sense in which that instance must stand as a kind of icon, as a bearer of the associations, political, cultural, and personal, we have with the determinate color? Another way of putting this is, how does the mere act of imaging redness or pinkness in this broad sense initiate meaning? Relatedly, how does color become representative, attached to webs or structures of significance? Considering the power of color, exemplified, for instance, in the fact that color has become one of the major encoding systems for difference in our culture, why is color so vulnerable to this kind of co-opting? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, a more general conclusion of the papers this morning has to do with the fact that the representational nature of color is a significant force in our lives, that the meanings we find in color are real and deeply important to how we think about the world and ourselves, even if those meanings are constructed in some critical sense. This idea that the meanings of color are constructed suggests that at least many of the patterns of significance involved in color perception and cognition are far from inevitable. If color can be dissociated from particular affective or automatically attached valences, how should we, individually and as a society, be moving to use color for positive social, personal, and political change? Ought we to be more informed about the sense in which we bear responsibility for the ways in which we manipulate and are manipulated by color?
Thanks so much, Louise. And I'd also like to echo Louise's thanks to the panel for what was really a wonderfully productive set of papers this morning. So I'm going to enter a slightly different mode of response. I wanted to direct a few questions at what I see as some maybe nodes that are emerging between the different panels and the papers and presentations we heard this morning. And maybe one sort of structuring principle for thinking about these questions would actually come from Professor Fleetwood's provocative revision of a familiar but also very urgent contemporary political slogan. So thinking about the relationship of matter and mattering. So Professor Fleetwood, I'm learning a tremendous amount from your exploration of the material apparatuses that go into the making of Black iconicity. I wanted to ask you today, what would happen if we took this model of the icon that you are developing and we put it alongside the work that we saw today from Torkwase Dyson? And obviously we're dealing with different immediate political goals and different sort of modes of aesthetic circulation. But I'm really struck by the relations that we're seeing in terms of an interest in making visible histories of violence, thinking about the ways in which the entanglement of Black bodies in these histories can be transformed into a work of making identity or memory or memorialization. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. or I'd also love to hear from Dyson on that point as well. I also just wanted to address, I think in Torkwase Dyson's work, we're seeing a really extraordinarily productive model of systemic thinking that we could maybe bring to the table on some of the other panelists and papers today. I'm really just astonished by your ability to think about the shared histories and the shaping geographies that would link together the violence of the slave trade and the violence of contemporary environmental extraction. So maybe to turn this systemic way of thinking around on other members of the panel, for instance, Professor Doyle, in terms of your investment in what you call the reciprocal relationships between self and environment, the feedback loops that you are exploring, what would it mean if we started to think about the environment as itself being a product of global histories and global economies? And maybe I'm going to pick up on a point from grad fellow Laura Soderberg here, but could we maybe turn this systemic thinking also to Professor Matthen, since you're already so interested in the ways in which colors gain information through networks of relation. Could we start to apply or what would be the value of applying the models for experience of color that you've offered us today in the direction of these bigger systems? I'd also like to ask Professor Matthen another question that I hope will involve the interests and engagements of the other members of this panel. And I think we've all really been provoked to thought by your concluding link between the informational paucity of color and aesthetic value. But I wanted to ask, and I think I'll be echoing some of Louise's comments here, but what about not only the aesthetic value of color, but also the social value of color? If, as Louise has discussed, we live in a visual-centric culture, if we are established social meanings and categories to a disproportionate extent through the largely arbitrary distinctions that we make between colors, might this also be connected to the fact that color tells us relatively little about the physical properties of things? And I'm just wondering, maybe this would be a way of turning to the whole panel and starting to think about some of the different models for relations between aesthetics and politics that I think we've seen put on the table today. Maybe we could think about ways in which we can relate these models, not necessarily to choose one or another, but to think about the possibilities of engagement through color that we're seeing advanced today. So thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Is it my turn? Yeah, really, thanks for, I was just absorbing those, so I think part of the silence that emerged on the other side is just that kind of absorption, that contemplation that comes not from the emptiness of what you were offering, but from the connections. In terms of the question you asked about what happens when we begin to inhabit these feedback loops and understand the environment, in those terms, in other words, understand the environment not as the environment as such, which is somehow out there, separate from our phenomenological experience of it. There was an extraordinarily interesting early 20th century Soviet, in fact, Ukrainian biologist by the name of Vladimir Vernadsky, who, based on the understanding at that time, he was a geophysicist, who many argue has been as important for the concept of biological space as Darwin was for the understanding of biological time, the way in which organisms unfold differentially over time, as well as through space for Vernadsky. Vernadsky was relatively unknown for a long time because it wasn't translated out of Russian until about 15 years ago, but he was very influential on the evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis, who, of course, is well known as both the co-author of the Gaia hypothesis with James Lovelock, which I would point to as precisely an understanding of human being in relationship to the environment as one that is part of an ongoing homeostatic set of processes far from equilibrium, in which our consciousness is not simply observing those processes, but are participating in those processes. What Margulis seemed to be particularly interested in Bernatsky, and I tried to follow up into my own work, is the function of attention on ecosystems. In other words, once we begin to diagram that relationship between self and environment as being involved in this feedback loop, which, I guess to the rest of the human species, we should say get a late pass, duh. That once we recognize that, we need to also begin to recognize that what we feel, that our consciousness and our utterances and our responsibility, as Louise put it, while they may be totally devoid of information, sometimes have a feedback effect on the environment in a way that Vernadsky named the noosphere. He pointed to the planetary mineral aspect of the Earth as the lithosphere, which then, about 3.5 billion years ago, under thermodynamic constraints, being bombarded by energy from the sun, manifested into the biosphere. Now, the biosphere did not simply add life to the lithosphere, but in fact began transforming it. So the steel that was in the car that took me from State College, Pennsylvania, was probably the result of bacteria in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So those bacteria started to change the planet. Within the biosphere, we got things like flowering plants, bacterial quorum sensing, plant sensation, and of course human consciousness, which is itself a biological phenomenon that is involved in this feedback loop on the environment. So I think very much a productive way of thinking about our own ecology of mind, as Gregory Bateson put it, is that despite the appearance of our separation from the biosphere, in fact, we are nothing but a manifestation of that biosphere involved in the ongoing transformation of it. The more we can incorporate that into our understanding, the more we seem to interact with and regard the biosphere as something other than an object that is there for our consumption, something to contemplate.
Thank you for the comments. I'm just, there's so much information that was shared this morning, and I feel like I'm just absorbing and processing right now. And I know very little about what you were sharing, but it was so beautiful. And one of the things that I kept thinking is, even as color is informationally, what did you say, poor? Is that it's nonetheless meaningful, so that so that something that is informational paucity in meaning or not, those are two different things to kind of untangle. That's what I was kind of thinking. And I think that experience of the pink light for me is an example of that. Or you waking up to that snowbank, and we've had similar experiences of, being at the ocean and what happens when that light hits the water, and there's so much meaning in it that we can't quite even comprehend. We write 9,000 pages and we still aren't finished. So that I'm playing around with that. But I also, Torkwase's video was so gorgeous and so immersive, and I was thinking about how a lot of the work with the icon and iconicity is about racist surface, and that her project is so immersive. And she said something about how you can't really comprehend the magnitude and scale of that. And I think that's why we attach ourselves so much to iconic form, especially racially iconic form, because racial violence is so overwhelming. When we think about 2 million people in prison, when we think about all the lives impacted just in this very moment, right? Not the 400 plus years of, this understanding of kind of our geopolitical structure and racial violence. So that to me is one reason that iconic form accumulates so much value, because we devalue so many millions and millions and millions of lives, that it is that that paradoxical relationship. It's kind of a parallelism that takes place around icon and value, I would say. We're just passing it down.
I want to talk about the difference, or think about like a James Turrell and an Albers, the difference between color that's created from pigment and or matter, and color that's created from light as a source. And those are very sort of material and scientific and measurable sort of structures that I lean on, right? And so I lean on them so that I, as an artist, can then use them as a medium. And just like Turrell uses light as a medium and combines, reds and blues to create a white, and which cannot possibly be produced from matter. Combining all those colors makes a sort of a sense of darkness or blackness. But what I'm interested in sort of all these conversations is that we know that because of artists and philosophers who finally understood this idea through evolution, how to really set up apparatuses to figure that out, right? And the time it took to establish that color wheel that you just showed, that simple color wheel, the time it took to sort of establish that consciousness is unique, of course, to human beings, while the sort of biosphere and atmosphere, it's like already there, right? So it's such an interesting idea that then the same humans that were able to establish theoretically and then materially tests that determine and produce that color wheel can then come from the same people who embody a sort of systemic racism or systemic prejudices between colors that create this environment of violence. So, we're here, and then we're not here. And then color in my work is a medium. It is trying to grapple with all of that together, and that by, in a sort of vague sense of abstraction, which I think sort of everything is abstraction, it's just where I land. Do you know what I mean? So, as an artist, thinking about that, knowing that I deal with like RGB colors, oh God. But colors in a digital frame that I'm trying to even get a sense of, or get my audience to sense these colors that I experience, with my eyes through this digital format, right? So it's such, and I say that to say in relationship to a sort of systemic development around, I guess, the issue of body and understanding of space. That's where my tension is, right? Because I'm out there touching, feeling water. My hands are becoming a different color underwater. I know that I'm following my body as I enter all these spaces as a Black woman differently, And then I touch the very real rigs. I understand, especially in the Gulf, the very real implications of spills. Like, I know the difference between soot, gook, that comes from an industrial spill, and soot and gook that comes from an oil spill. Those have very different visualizations, right? And I don't want to talk about like environmental disaster porn, where a lot of images are taken. Oh, how beautiful these images are of this oil spill, completely removed from context. But that's an aesthetic hazard, right? And even though I think it's framed as a sort of, you're admiring, oh, how wonderful this moment is, but how gross it is. So I'm just trying to find my way. I studied with Dick Lytle, who studies under Joseph Albers at Yale, so I'm very embedded in that information. And then I'm still embedded and affected by, everything that's happening to the Black body and police force. And then I'm very intrigued by, like how we got here, like physically, the sort of history. Yeah, so I'm just trying to figure it all out. And I don't even remember, you two set up a dynamic. I hope that I'm responding to it, but that was a lot, right? I'm like, wow, who has time to think like that, right? But students and academics and, I need to go back to Yaddo and not make anything, not make paintings, just read books.
So, is this on? Yes. So here's a question. So this part of my pen is the same color as the buttons on Louise's sweater. So what does that tell us about either the pen or those buttons? It tells us absolutely nothing. On the other hand, if you take a small group of objects, for example, human faces, what does it tell me if somebody's color changes, somebody goes pale or somebody darkens? When I was growing up, I was always struck at the fact that it was always a matter of conversation among us teenagers that we brown people don't blush. So how can you tell that we're embarrassed? Well, you can actually. So in small, very restricted classes of objects, such as faces or fruits of a certain type or soot, the color of something will tell you something about it. But that's because you've learned that, you've made an association, or maybe the species has learned it. Maybe we get born with the ability to read faces to some degree. That's true. So color just sits out there as a classifier, as something that enables you to put things into classes. Sometimes that's useful, sometimes it's not. So I would say, in answer to your question about social value, that a lot of the social value of color comes simply from the fact that we enjoy looking at it. So you remarked on the amount of work that went into constructing the Swedish natural color system or the Mansell color system. Those are color systems which are enormously rich, they're very well researched. There are organizations which are in place that maintain those systems, maintain the standards that those systems embody. Why? That they're for designers, basically. And what do designers do with color? They make something that we want to look at. But there's also this other social thing which came out so clearly in Nicole's presentations, that because you can use color to group things, you can use color to group things to destructive effect. We don't even know, we sort of casually talk about black and white in human skin when there's actually no such thing as black and white in human skin. Nonetheless, you can use these sorts of meaningless classifications to endow them with meaning which is deeply problematic. Whether it's class in India or race in North America. These are uninformative classifications, tell us nothing about the intrinsic nature of what they're classifying, but which we use as hooks for other kinds of judgments and other kinds of categorizations, right? Which it just happens to be there to enable us to do something which is in itself meaningless.
There seems to be a tension here with the pink and what you're saying. There seems to be a tension.
Between what Richard is saying.
I think I can resolve it perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I liked about your last sentence is that, you know, I've been coming at the side of trying to understand why was it pink? You know, what of all the different colors, why was it pink? And you know, the easy immediate answer is like, well, because it got his attention, right? Okay, so the pink as a gradient against the background of the other colors popped in a way that perhaps another color would not. But it's also, which then leads him on this wild goose chase to try to understand and comprehend the informational content of something exterior to him, which is actually approaching zero informational content. It may have social meaning, it may have other sets of meaning that emerge in this second level of sort of semantic historical context that we're discussing. But in and of itself, its informational paucity actually makes Philip K. Dick, the writer, look at what is producing the information in the pink, which is himself. So, and that helps resolve why is it that that color, which bears no information, can be so enormously contemplative. Precisely because it has no content, like the ocean or that snowbank, it allows us to reflect back onto that which is beholding the color, which in every other instance we're completely taking for granted. In other words, we don't so much, that the color holds no informational content whatsoever concerning the world, but in holding no informational content, it allows for the encounter with self. Because otherwise, the informational content of the world crowds out self. And this is striking throughout the literature on the history of mysticism. If you look at Bohm, and then you go back to somebody like Augustine, the figure of light is always forcing the perceiver and the contemplative to ask, whence comes the light? And because there's no origin to the light, there's no information that would send you to the place where the light comes from, you're forced to confront the self. And I think that Kant's later work on the sublime then might be interesting in that moment. But I think that, is there a different tension with the pink?
There's a different, for me there's also that moment where the pink hits, before he starts to, there's the meaning that he did. It's when the pink hits, right?
I hear you.
That in itself seems, that instant seems to be very rich, and that as an experience of color, right? So is there an experience of color that's different than its informational paucity?
Well, it may be that it's a signal with no content.
So it's a problem in cognitive evolution, but why we have color vision at all. And if it doesn't give us much information, what does it do for us? And there's a very interesting hypothesis which came up, I guess, about 20 years ago, that color, what primates use color for is not so much the information that's available in an expanse of color, but rather information which is available in high contrast situations. So there's John Mullen's hypothesis is that for monkeys, the ability to have color vision gives them an ability to pick out fruit against a background of foliage. So the fruit is, in that part of the world, is red, the foliage, of course, is dark green, and so for organisms that have color vision, the fruit, as they say, as psychologists say, pops out against the background of color. Whereas if you see a black and white photograph of that scene, it is, you can't, without considerable difficulty, pick out which are the fruit. So it gave the monkey the ability immediately upon looking at a forested scene to pick out the fruit. So that's a connection which, the way I've described it, I tried to describe it in a way that has echoes with Philip Dick's. That suddenly there's just this phenomenon and it pops out at you, captures your attention. In this particular case, it is informationally useless. But in the case of the monkey, it's informationally very rich because it tells it right away where to go for food.
But I think the paradox that Nicole, Professor Fleetwood may be pointing towards is that it was immensely generative of information. And so one interesting thing to put into that context there, another hypothesis for the function of color in natural systems is not for natural selection, but for sexual selection, for example, among birds. And it's for this capacity to discern the tiny differences that are not meaningful in terms of survival, etc., but are meaningful in terms of courtship, that color emerges in birds, and, for example, the incredible display of bird song itself that Darwin writes about extensively emerges. So it's that gradient of difference that you're pointing to, the way in which color can pop out, or a tone differentially can pop out, that I think is what accounts for what hit PKD in the head.
But it also seems like it's an awakening of sensory experience.
Yes.
The way that you at least described it. I don't know this.
That's how he wrote it.
Yeah, that it's an awakening of sensory experience, and it's that moment of aliveness, of perception, of aliveness, right? So it still seems to me, there's something, there's a gap there, and it's a productive gap,
I guess I like the sort of arc between the two ideas, in the sense that, okay, so when I'm in water, or what happened today, what just happened today to me, in the sense that I thought I was dealing with a history, and from a few words just before I stood up, I realized I was really also dealing with the phenomenological experience of seeing and associating. So there's a very, broad space of color having no association with meaning, just sort of existing in relationship or, in comparison to a sphere, right? So, just physically, I know, as you pointed out, I can't stack a sphere. The sort of principles and or the logic behind that object is measurable to a great extent, right? And we can then apply that logic to other things, and that logic works independent from me. So with color, I now enjoy and will then think about the way in which at moments that color can exist independent from my sensoria, or sort of grappling with that. Simultaneously, my mind, because I'm a human, and this sort of sense of the way my brain and eyes work, in relationship to that becomes subject itself. And so, as I know that now, then I can then go back to myself, like that pink. Right? That pink made him go back to himself, which is where the richness lies, and the sort of structure in place that talks about the independent color and talks about the corporal color, is so, that's where I'm at right now. That's what shifted in my practice today. So,
Yeah, I'm linking on the moment of perception, I think. I don't have anything else.
Me neither.
Both of them exist.
Yeah, they exist.
Yeah, maybe we can open it up for 5 minutes to the room. Does anyone have a question?
Because the color of the sun, or
Don't look at it.
in relationship to harvesting it, right? It's we realize we can harvest power from the sun, but that thing exists, both like a color and like, an optical experience, or I don't know. But there's something there that I haven't figured out. And now everyone hasn't figured it, knows I haven't figured it out because we're all on camera. But there's something somewhere.
One more thing. What's interesting about the informational paucity of color is that even though, as you pointed out, all this work in the history of science and this excellent deduction that we've come to conclude that there's the informational paucity of color, that what's interesting that as experiential beings, nor can we avoid applying meaning to that color. And it's that simultaneous absence of any intrinsic informational value and our inability to avoid it. It's very consonant with language itself. Like everything that you were saying about the lack of referentiality between color and that which it is labeling, really at a certain level can be applied to language itself. That, I know nothing about a cow based on the word cow, and yet it's a useful labeling system that I often fall into completely and forget. And as Alan Watts, the writer, put it, I sometimes try to eat the menu instead of having meal, right? That we mistake the map for the territory, as another tradition put it. But perhaps nowhere is that more kind of apparent and less available to our reflection than in color that has taken on these institutionalized and historical meanings, which we can't just shrug off because once we know the cognitive paucity of information there, because those structures are still transmitting, as it were.
I'll just say a word. I had actually resolved not to say anything more. But here's a fact. The color is for attention, right? That's John Mullen's hypothesis, and it's a plausible one. Yet it has very little significance. So it's salient but insignificant. So what does the combination mean? The combination means that it's really hungry for meaning. Mm-hmm. And because it's hungry for meaning, we are just constantly invited to invest it with meaning.